My name is GINNY TRANCHIK, and I'm welcoming you tonight and thanking you for joining us to support Born Free USA. We have a really exciting evening planned for tonight and a wonderful panel of speakers. Angela Grimes, Born Free USA CEO, who will give you a brief overview of the Born Free work and the inspiration for its founding. Following will be Charles Siebert, Born Free USA Honorary Council member and our featured speaker. And trust me, you will not be disappointed because he totally blew me away in our rehearsals. And then Dr. Liz Tyson, Born Free USA Programs Director, will speak about the issues facing animals in captivity. Following Liz's presentation, we will answer your questions. So please feel free to send in questions via chat or Q&A, questions or comments throughout the event. So just to give you a little bit of background on me, I'm also a member of the Born Free Honorary Council. I went to a fundraiser they had last fall and was totally inspired by founder Virginia McKenna. And for those of you who know the movie Born Free, she was the blonde mom to Elsa, and her son Will Travers when they spoke at their at the fundraising event. And I said to two of my friends who had brought me there, I said, how can I get involved with this organization? And hence I was able to really connect, get on the honorary board, and really experience the wonderful work that's being done and promote the organization. So I hope you'll all join me tonight in making a donation. You can go on anytime during the event to bornfreeusa.org.benefit, or you can pledge simply in chat. So gifts of all size are welcome. I mean, this is really expensive work. There's not a lot of funding like there are for other types of organization. Animal welfare and policy organizations really do not have a wide, deep variety of folks of foundations and government funding that they can go to. So that's why we really depend on individuals to pledge. So for those of you who are compelled to give $1,000 or higher, the first 3 donors will be able to choose from 3 images by renowned wildlife photographer and conservationist Faisal Ismail. And these are his pictures, which I think you will all agree are really terrific. For gifts of $250 or more, Liz has generously donated her prints of animals. Again, all fabulous. You can choose from some of these actually reside in the Born Free sanctuaries. So you could choose between the gorilla, elephant, cheetah, and lion. And now, if you made our Born to Be Wild cocktail, and like many of my friends who have complained that it was just too much of a difficult recipe to follow, raise your wine glass or your beer bottle with me, or your martini, whatever, and let's toast to keeping wildlife where they belong, and that's in the wild. So thank you, everybody, again. And now I'd like to introduce Angela, who is the CEO of Born Free USA. Take it away, Angela.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for hosting us tonight. It's really wonderful to be here. I know that we have many of our current donors who know us well, supporters, followers, activists, and possibly some new people. So I really want to reiterate what Ginny said and talk to us in the chat. While, we'll be responding not only at the end with questions, but, we'll also be communicating as much as we can. So tell us where you're from, react to what you're hearing, and, we'd love to have a really nice chat conversation with you. So for those of you who may just be new and just getting to know Born Free, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about us, and then we'll get on to our star attraction, Mr. Siebert. Born Free's vision is a coexistent future where humans no longer exploit wild animals, and we work to ensure that all wild animals, whether they're living in captivity or in the wild, are treated with the compassion and respect that they deserve and are able to live their lives according to their needs. Born Free is a global organization. We have offices in the United States, the United Kingdom, as well as Kenya, South Africa, and Ethiopia. And collectively throughout the Born Free family, we are working to protect animals, wildlife, their habitat, and work with communities on 5 continents: North America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Europe, and Asia and Oceania. We're also fighting to end a number of threats that affect not only the entire, survival of entire species, but also individual lives. And these include the trade in wild animals and their parts, trapping and fur, and working on a policy level from local all the way up to international, intergovernmental levels to protect and put in very important protections for animals. We also rescue and care for animals and monkeys in particular in our sanctuaries, including our primate sanctuary in Texas that is home to more than 450 monkeys, many of whom were rescued from research labs as well as captive situations such as private homes or roadside zoos. And Liz is talking to you today from the primate sanctuary in Texas. And then, of course, today's topic, we're advocating for an end to wild animal captivity. This includes keeping of animals in zoos, roadside menageries, aquaria, and in the pet trade. As Ginny mentioned, Born Free, it's no coincidence that our name is Born Free and there was a film, Born Free. That iconic 1960s film starred our founders, Virginia McKenna and Bill Travers, and it told the real life story of Elsa, an orphaned lioness who was rehabilitated and returned to the wild. Another of Virginia and Bill's co-stars was the ultimate inspiration for the beginning of Born Free. Pole Pole was a baby elephant taken from her mother and her family and used in a film called An Elephant Called Slowly. Pole Pole is Swahili for slowly. The Kenyan government had promised her to the London Zoo, and when the filming was over, Virginia and Bill tried and were successful in convincing the government to allow Pole Pole to remain in Kenya. But unfortunately, that would have meant that another elephant family would be ripped apart, another baby taken to fulfill that promise to the London Zoo. So Pole Pole was eventually sent to London. We certainly couldn't have another family, in sadness. Many years later, Virginia and Bill went to visit Pole Pole and in the London Zoo, and she reached out her trunk. She obviously remembered them and still connected them. And seeing her loneliness and her suffering, they launched a campaign to have her moved to a more suitable facility. But tragically, Pole Pole died before that could happen, barely having known her own native land and her family. Which really leads us to the purpose of tonight's gathering. We're thrilled to give you the opportunity to hear from Charles Siebert, Born Free USA Honorary Council member and recipient of Born Free USA's 2019 Wildlife Ambassador Award. Charles has written many features and books about the cruelty of keeping wild animals in captivity and about the fraught relationship between humans and other animal species, including a cover story in the New York Times Magazine about the import of 18 African elephants by 3 US zoos. This piece had quite an impact, and it helped drive the passage of a resolution by CITES, that's the International Intergovernmental Treaty on Endangered Species, that limits the future import of wild elephants for zoo exhibits. Tonight, he's going to talk about his many experiences visiting with and writing about animals and what they reveal about themselves and us. And through the stories of individual captive animals, from a chimpanzee forced to perform in an all-chimpanzee circus orchestra to elephant and whale ventriloquist, Charles will demonstrate the suffering caused by captivity and our failure to ask, what on earth are they saying? And with that, thank you, Charles. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Angela, so much. And thank you, Born Free USA, for having me. I have to now go back to share screen, am I right?
Yes, you can share your screen.
Okay. All right. I hope this is visible to everybody. I've never done this by, Zoom virtually, but there may be a few hiccups. But thanks again to Born Free USA, and thank you all out there for taking part in this tonight in these times and circumstances. That title that's posed there, What on Earth Are They Saying? I don't mean by posing it to suggest that I have a literal answer to the question. I'm not playing Dr. Dolittle, and neither have I ever in my writing about animals, but what I have come to know in my many years of being among non-human intelligences is that there are a lot of exchanges going on out there from everything from between goldfish to whales that are no less compelling for being beyond our immediate comprehension. And I thought I'd start off with, speaking of goldfish, with a rather ridiculously amazing story that I'm not even sure what to make of about goldfish. Excuse me. That was related by a retired neuroscientist who lives just outside of Lisbon in Portugal. He went out to his backyard not so long ago to feed his 2 comet goldfish that he keeps in a shallow pond back there. And one of the goldfish was found on the grass writhing. And goldfish are known to do this. They don't know if it's a buildup of ammonia in the water or just genuine restlessness about being captive. And he picked it up and put the fish back in the pond. And probably because of hypoxia, a prolonged lack of oxygen, the fish sank to the bottom. And but it was still alive. And he later came out to feed the 2 fish, the one on the bottom and the one that was healthy. And the food was floating on the top, and the healthy fish ate for a while. And then to this man's amazement, he saw that healthy fish dive down, put its body under the wounded goldfish and raise it on its own body to the top so that it might eat. I don't even know how to parse that or explain it. It just suggests levels of empathy and that are going on out there that I think we need to be more attuned to. Things like, for example, another recent study that just came out about zebrafinch mothers. They actually sing to their eggs before they're born. And depending on the song that the mother sings, it shapes the size of their baby when it comes out, so that if there's a drought, the mother sings one song so that the baby will be born smaller size so that it can tolerate high heat. I could talk to you at length about starlings, who I hear daily on my Brooklyn fire escape. I just wrote a piece about them for the Times, an ode to them. But they're so complex and inventive in their songs that they've been studied to understand the source of our language, of human language. So these kinds of consiliences and connections are all about what I try to write about. And then there's, to get to whales, they've actually done a recent study where humpback whales that they found actually have different accents. And that whales from one territory will have a certain accent. And if they pass through another whale's territory, they'll pass on that accent to those whales. So you can study humpbacks and find out where they're from, which is rather incredible. My slide is not moving. Is this not sharing? Oh, here it is. I guess it's clicking on. Can all see this? I can't hear anyone. Okay. Sorry. This, speaking of Brooklyn, is where I grew up, in the middle of row house, the one that I have pointed on here. And I was one of 7 children, and how I ended up writing about wild animals, having grown up there, I'll have no idea. The closest I got to a wild animal in Brooklyn was my Sicilian mother charging out of the back kitchen with pots of boiling water to kill the ants in the sidewalk nests out front. But anyway, through happy circumstance, I ended up being able to share a good portion of my life with with non-humans. They make for better interviews anyway, I found, when you're writing journalism. I'm often asked about the overarching theme or overarching themes in my writing, and one of them that I've always cited is the ongoing inability of humans to see ourselves as animals and to see animals as themselves, as individuals outside the confines of our allegories and our symbolizing and our showcasing. And a classic example of what I mean by that is I found in this book, The Metaphysics of Aids. This is a painting by Rembrandt that you may recognize called The Anatomy Lesson, about Dr. Nicolaus Tulp, who in the middle of the 17th century, he was the leading anatomist, mayor of Amsterdam, a physician, and one of the pioneering thinkers of the Enlightenment, stressing objective observation and representation of the world around us. During his tenure there in Amsterdam, a Dutch West Indies trip returning from a trading expedition happened to make a stop in, they think, Liberia, and picked up a chimpanzee from the wild, where it was gotten from no one knows, and deposited this with all of its other goods, deposited this chimp at the docks of The Hague. And it's believed to be the first chimpanzee that ever set foot on the shores of Europe. And you could imagine what the response of Europeans was to this animal so human-like being witnessed for the first time. It was quickly shuttled off to the menagerie of the Prince of Orange, the leader of Amsterdam. And it was there in his menagerie that this scientist, Nicolaus Tulp, sat with his notebook and sketched for 3 or 4 days this chimpanzee. And this is what he arrived at. This is his actual drawing, and I think you can all agree this bears no resemblance whatsoever to a chimpanzee. It's some sort of weird hybrid between a orangutan, a forest satyr, and a drunk on a bench. Notice the tapered hands and feet. What's fascinating about this is it used exactly to all the ancient mythic conceptions of near human primates. I guess they were so scary to the human intelligence that they had to be made into mythic figures. So they were considered sort of like wild men of the forest, drunken, crazy rapists of women, and kind of living cautionary tales to humans about a way we might devolve if we abandoned the constraints of civilization. And I just found it fascinating that a man of science like Nicolaus Tulp wouldn't even let his hands draw what he was seeing before him, but instead he drew an ancient myth. We may think of that as a kind of relic of past thinking, but we should think again. This is Roger. Roger is the chimp to whom Angela referred, a cellist in an all-chimp orchestra at Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus for years. And then the act shut down, and poor Roger ended up in a roadside zoo. And just by sheer good fortune, he ended up in the care of a woman named Patty Reagan, who established the Center for Great Apes in Wauchula, Florida, for chimps like Roger, retired entertainers. They've been in commercials, they've been in movies, they've been in circuses. Roger was the main subject of this book of mine, the Wauchula Woods Accord, because when I walked into that sanctuary for the first time, Roger took a particularly strong liking to me, and Patty Reagan even commented upon it and said, I don't know what this is all about. And I had I don't know, just totally understandable reaction. And I asked Patty if I could move in with Roger for a while. I'll never forget that phone call to my wife. Honey, I'm moving in with a chimpanzee for a time. And she was fine with it. But anyway, Roger was a chimp that didn't know how to be a chimp. He just preferred human beings because that's all he grew up around. He was a kind of humanzee. So distorted by us that he didn't know his own nature. He eventually came around, but he leads me to this next chimp, who's another chimp that didn't know how to be a chimp, because from day one, she was taken from her mother's side and raised by a scientist couple, Maurice and Jane Temerlin from the University of Oklahoma, both of them psychologists. And this was in the late 70s into the 80s. And it was thought of as a cutting edge experiment at the time. Lucy was featured on television talk shows and news shows and was taught sign language. And Jane the doll met Lucy. And the whole premise was just as distorted as what Nicolaus Tulp did back in the 17th century, except that where he was trying to make a chimp be an old ancient myth, here was a man of science trying to make a chimpanzee into a human. He even called Lucy his daughter. You can see here in a dress, probably less than 1 year of age. I don't know how old she is in this picture, but she's learned to use a vanity mirror. She had her own bedroom upstairs, built for her especially when she got too big and a little dangerous. But I talked to Jane Goodall about this chimp not too long ago. We had a chance to meet up, and I asked her if it was true that she had met Lucy, and she said yes. And I asked her if the story was true about what she witnessed, and she did. And she said that Lucy came down from the upstairs bedroom, walked into the Temerlin's kitchen, opened a cabinet, made herself a gin and tonic, and then proceeded to go over to the couch and read a magazine. And she did this all the time. The only chimps that Lucy ever encountered were in magazines or on television. So whereas most people who do this with chimps, that a lot of people try to keep a chimp as a pet, they'll give up after a year or two because the animal, just gets too strong and strong-willed. Chimpanzees are 6-7 times stronger than the strongest human being. Temerlins kept their chimp, this Lucy, for 11 years. And finally, after 11 years, they decided enough was enough, that they had to make a decision. And they couldn't, this was their beloved daughter, quote unquote, and they couldn't countenance putting her in a zoo or a research lab. So they made the equally hubristic move, in my mind, to send her to Africa to try to be a wild chimp after all her time in civilization. And they sent with her an intern, one of Dr. Temerlin's interns, a young woman named Janice Carter from Oklahoma, sent her with Lucy to help Lucy make the transition into the wild. And what I'm about to read to you is an excerpt of what happened from my book about what happened to this attempt to make Lucy a wild animal. The plan was for Carter to accompany Lucy and Marion, another captive-born chimp, to a temporary holding facility in a small forest reserve near Banjul, the capital of Gambia, to help Lucy get acclimated to her new environment. After 3 weeks, Carter was to return home to the United States. Lucy, however, became deeply depressed and came down with a number of illnesses, and Carter soon found herself extending her stay for longer and longer periods. In the end, Carter wound up staying at the reserve outside Banjul for 3 years, taking on 7 other former captive chimps in that time. Then in the spring of 1979, she moved all 9 of her charges 200 miles inland to one of 5 baboon islands along the Gambia River, thus setting in motion one of the odder episodes ever recorded in the history of interspecies relations. To facilitate the chimp's transition back to nature, Carter resorted to a radical gesture. She had a group of British commandos who were training on the island build for her a big wire enclosure. She then took her few possessions, moved into the enclosure, and locked the chimps out. She would become, in effect, the captive that her chargers once were, so that they might discover the free wild beasts that they were never allowed to be. From the beginning, Carter wrote, the chimps would have to accept that I alone lived in a cage. Carter, especially at the beginning, did make frequent instructive forays into the surrounding jungle to school the chimps, climbing trees and foraging for food, eating everything from figs to ants, living, she wrote, more as a chimpanzee than as a human. She even built herself a treetop platform to sleep on at night by way of encouraging the chimps to build their own nest. The 7 chimps she had inherited were all wild-born and so had some survival skills. Marianne, meanwhile, had been in the company of other chimps for much of her life in captivity and was able to integrate with the others and copy what they were doing. Lucy, however, approached matters quite differently. As the largest of the 9 chimps on the island and the only one who could converse with Carter in sign language, Lucy was yet another evolutionary anomaly that only we humans could fashion, the dominant chimp of her group, and yet the one least capable of surviving on her own. She insisted on drinking water as Carter did from a bottle and not from the river. While other chimps would be at the top of a baobab tree foraging for food, Lucy would steadfastly refuse to climb, positioning herself instead at the base of the tree and waiting for edible morsels to fall. Carter writes of one instance when Lucy asked her in sign language for help getting food from a tree. Carter tried to show her a quick way up the tree from an adjacent one, but Lucy took Carter by the hand, put that hand against the tree trunk, and then signed, "More food, Janice, go." Carter eventually decided to retreat to her enclosure, stop all communication with Lucy, and leave her to find food on her own. A standoff ensued, Lucy positioning herself outside Carter's cage, refusing to move, growing more and more emaciated. She'd whine and pluck her hair out and occasionally sign, "Food, drink, Janice, come out, Lucy's hurt." When Carter tried to shoo her away, Lucy would go a short distance off and then slowly make her way back to the side of the cage again. This went on for months, Carter reports, and then one day she and Lucy, exhausted from their struggle, fell asleep beside one another. When Carter awoke, she found Lucy sitting up now on the other side of the enclosure, offering Carter a leaf through the bars. Carter ate some and gave the rest to Lucy, and from that point on, Carter says, Lucy finally began to fend for herself, gradually regaining her health and strength. In 1985, a full 6 years after setting up her Bamboo Island camp, Carter decided it was time to leave Lucy and the others to their own devices. Lucy had by then seemingly made a successful transition to her new surroundings. She even adopted an orphan baby male chimpanzee, and then managed to overcome her grief when that baby died of a stomach parasite 3 years later. She also survived her own near-fatal bout of hookworm, and by the time of Carter's departure was in good physical health and showing positive signs of social interaction with the other chimps. And yet for Lucy, as Carter would learn in the course of a subsequent visit to the island by boat from her new base camp downriver, the boundary between Lucy's life and her rightful natural place in the world would remain forever contentious and confused, the boundary between her former life and what would be her natural place. There's a photograph from that visit of Carter's, one that is almost too fraught to look at. I hope you can make it out. Janice personally gave me permission to use this slide. This was taken in 1986, some 6 months after Carter's initial departure from the island. Carter had just pulled her boat ashore, and Lucy, always the first to greet any human visitor to the island, rushed out of the jungle to her old friend's side. The two of them sit clutching one another by the waters of the Gambia River, a wall of jungle rising behind them, each of them outcasts of their original selves, like two primates, you might say, passing in the night. Carter, the classic American suburban girl, looking more attuned now to jungle living than her suburban-raised, humanized chimp counterpart. Lucy's head bowed against Carter's chest, as though in mortification, her long left hand furled against her face, beneath a mournful, downcast brow. Carter had brought with her some of Lucy's possessions from the past, pens and papers, books, a doll, a hat, and a mirror, Lucy, she told me, gave them only a cursory look before standing, looking back at Carter, and then walking off into the jungle. A year later, Lucy's skeleton, minus the hands and feet, would be found on the grounds of Carter's former camp, near the site of her old wire enclosure. There were no indications of her having suffered a fall or an attack from another animal. One possible scenario of her end, given the missing hands and feet and skin, is that Lucy, still drawn more to people than to members of her own species, approached in greeting a group of poachers who readily seized upon their overeager prey. Janice is still in the jungle. She never came back. She's devoted her life to trying to save the remaining wild chimps in that area of Western Africa where she is, Gambia, in Guinea, in Suriname. But she and I are in touch, and I've often flirted with the idea of doing a book about her called The Woman Who Fell Out of Time. Anyway, it's one very heartbreaking story about what can happen when we distort a creature's natural identity for our own reasons. This is quite a transition, but this is an animal you'll recognize. It's a 747 jumbo jet, and this was the plane that was dispatched by 3 US zoos that Angela also mentioned in her introduction. 3 zoos that stole away with 18 elephants from Swaziland, the subject of my story this past July in the New York Times. I say stole away because, yes, the US Fish and Wildlife Service mysteriously granted a permit for the transport of these elephants, even against the objections of 100 of the top elephant scientists and wildlife biologists in the world. But a lawyer at the last minute filed a suit against Fish and Wildlife for that decision. The zoos joined in the suit against this lawyer, this animal rights lawyer, and they agreed, a judge agreed to hear it, and there was to be a court hearing that the zoos agreed to fully. And 9 days before that agreed to court hearing, they secretly dispatched this plane to Swaziland, if you can secretly dispatch a 747. And it arrived there in Swaziland, and the 18 elephants were snuck to the airport on a rainy morning. And these are the pictures of the elephants being unloaded from their transport trucks onto the tarmac, soon to be lifted into the belly of Flight 805. That's Flight 805 that you saw on the tarmac. And this, I'm just going to read a few quick excerpts from that are partially from that piece in the Times. Any lingering doubts about Flight 805's mission would soon be settled in a subsequent series of photographs taken by a journalist for the Times of Swaziland. In them, reflector-vested airport workers, as well as khaki-clad veterinarians and animal handlers, are seen standing beside or directly atop flatbed transport trailers bearing large white metal shipping crates with lattices of air slats on either side, the curved outline of an elephant's back visible within each crate. In a couple of the photos, the crates, too small for the inhabitants to lie down in, dangle in midair as a long-arm crane lifts and lowers them to the tarmac below, the torsos and hands of the human attendants around them anxiously craning and caressing at each crate's tilt and sway, gestures of deep care within the constraints of an inescapably cruel act. An airborne elephant, even one with just 2 front feet aloft, the signature shtick of countless parades and circus acts over the ages, is a totem of torture. The earth is to elephants as the ocean is to whales. It is their medium, their world, their instrument. They migrate vast distances across it, along long ago designated and culturally reinforced routes. They cover themselves in it as protection from the sun. They gather the bones of their dead herd members on it for extended and recurring mourning rituals, during which they'll caress the bones with their trunk, taking turns rubbing them along the teeth of a skull's lower jaw, just the way living elephants do when greeting one another. And perhaps most vitally, elephants communicate through the earth, play it like a tom-tom, sending and feeling multi-mile long subsonic ground vibrations felt through exquisitely tuned sensors in the padding of their feet. A circus elephant has to be beaten into learning to adopt a bipedal pose. A newly rested wild one slated for air transport to a zoo, drugged. The 2 front feet aloft are all 4 at 38,000, is equally aberrant to an elephant. But then life for Flight 805's passengers began in trauma. They were all the orphans of population culls in South Africa's Kruger National Park in order to reduce herd density and make more room for humans, a gruesome practice, no matter the method employed. Sometimes concealed gunmen will make conspicuous sounds in order to coerce the matriarch and elder bulls to gather close around their young in easily dispatched groupings. Helicopters are often employed to herd elephants toward a waiting battery of machine guns. Matriarchs are picked off early in order to render the rest of the herd a lost and rudderless mass. One method, eventually outlawed for being, quote, too inhumane, unquote, involved darting the elephants with a heart surgery sedative known as scoline, a neuromuscular anesthetic that was discovered to leave the paralyzed elephants fully conscious as their armed executioners approached to finish them off. In the aftermath of any culling, babies are often tethered to the bodies of their slain parents so that they can be readily gathered up on station elsewhere. Herds 100 miles away from a cull, meanwhile, will scurry off and huddle and hide. They're aware of so much elephants, it's frightening. They read remote ground rumblings, discern faraway windborne scents, and hear over vast distances subsonic cries of elephantine terror, screams beneath the register of our hearing, silent screams. Lock up in storage sheds, as park rangers will often do, post-cull elephant body parts, and other elephants will invariably come later from miles around to smash their way in and retrieve the remains in order to give them a proper burial. One night at the Makaya Wildlife Reserve in Swaziland, I asked an employee there why I had seen no elephants in the course of that day's safari. I was told that they'd all been very skittish and aloof since the departure of Flight 805, even though the 18 elephants on board were taken from a different Swaziland reserve, some 50 kilometers away. I'm going to transition now. Yes, that's a piece I wrote in 2006 about trauma being suffered not just by captive elephants, but collectively by wild elephants due to ceaseless human encroachment. And the answer to that sad question is sadly, yes, we are driving elephants, an entire culture across their range, out of their minds. We are really some species. I want to introduce you now to what I call the chorus, a chorus of the misconstrued. This here is a beluga whale named Nosy. Nosy was one of 6 belugas, excuse me, who was stolen by the US Navy from the waters of the Hudson Bay in northern Canada. Stolen for the purpose of spying on Russian submarines, believe it or not. The Navy had long used dolphins for reconnaissance work, but once the Russians in the 80s started developing submarines that could hide under the Arctic ice, they could no longer use dolphins, so they went for belugas. And they kidnapped 6 of them. Nosy at the time was a young adolescent male, ripped from his family's side. Belugas are incredibly complexly social animals, like elephants, like other whales, like parrots, who I'll talk about soon, like a lot of intelligent animals are, frequent nonstop talkers. They're called the canaries of the sea. They're always talking to one another. One biologist, wildlife biologist, who recorded them said they sounded like school kids screaming in a distant schoolyard. an image that's always stuck with me. Anyway, Nosy was sequestered in a pen by himself in San Diego to be trained. And the Navy scientists around him began to hear after a long period of time of Nosy being there, very strange sounds emanating from Nosy's pen. Indeed, one day there was a group of Navy divers trying to do repairs and practice sessions underwater, and they were talking through underground walkie-talkies to their officer on shore. And at one point, all the divers raced up to the surface and said to their governing officer, "Why did you tell us to get out of the water?" And he said, "I didn't say a word." And so the scientists became suspicious of what was going on. And they thought, could this be Nosy? And so sure enough, the very compliant Nosy allowed for all these sonic testing devices to be inserted in her blowhole and listen to him do his sounds. And this is what the scientists produced. This recording went viral on the internet, and most people, unfortunately, thought it kind of humorous, and made comparisons of, like, it sounds like he's playing a kazoo and all those kinds of things. And when the scientists studied that sonograph, they were shocked to realize that the rhythms, the octaves, the tenors, everything about it was entirely human and not whale, completely different from whale. And so what was happening here was that a social animal like Nosy, so deprived of her conspecifics, was pressured basically into speaking the language of her captors just to exercise a deep social urge. This same phenomena occurred again with a similarly intelligent being, an elephant. This is Koshik, who spent 6 years of his early life alone in a zoo, the Neverland Zoo in Korea. And he fashioned a way, as I'll explain in a next excerpt that includes parrots, he found a way to speak Korean words. And these are just a few of the Korean words. He's speaking, mimicking his trainer. I'll explain what Koshik was doing there after this next clip. This is from a documentary that Robbie Kenner, who was nominated for an Academy Award for his movie Food Inc. He made a documentary based on my story from 2000, I think this was 2016, on an extraordinary sanctuary in Los Angeles where traumatized orphan parrots, wild parrots, and traumatized war veterans were healing each other through nonverbal cross-species communication. And I was always fascinated by this place, and finally convinced the Times to let me write about it, and it became a cover story. And Robbie Kenner did this documentary based on my story. He allowed me to show this clip of a parrot called Julius, which I'll show you now. Oh, sorry.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Hello. you doing? What? What do you think? Actually, it's...
This is the cover story that I wrote about this sanctuary, and I'm just going to read to you one section. I was going to read two, but I think I'm going on too long. So I'll just read you one and see where we end up here. Abandoned parrots are twice traumatized beings, denied first their natural will to flock, and then the company of the humans who own them. In the wild, parrots ply the air mostly in the same way that whales do the sea, together and intricately. Longtime pairs fly wing to wing within extended, close-knit social groupings in which the individual members scientists have recently discovered each have unique names. Parrots learn to speak them soon after birth, during a transitional period of vocalizing equivalent to human baby babbling, known as subsong, in order to better communicate with members of their own flocks and with other flocks. This, it turns out, is the root of that vaunted gift for mimicry, which, along with their striking plumages and beguilingly fixed, wide-eyed stares, has long induced humans to keep parrots, neuronally hardwired flock animals with up to 60 to 70-year lifespans and the cognitive capacities of a 4 to 5-year-old child, all to ourselves in a parlor cage, a broken flight of human fancy, a keening kidnappee. There were 34 parrots at Serenity Park when I was there that summer, a majority of them abandoned and now deeply traumatized, former pets that had outlived either their owners or their owners' patience. A parrot separated from its flock will flock fully and fiercely to the attentions and affections of its new human keeper. And when that individual, for whatever reason, fails to uphold his or her end of such an inherently exclusive relationship, the effects are devastating. Up and down the aviary line corridor of Serenity Park are the winged wreckages of such broken bonds. On and on they go, the ceaseless pacing, rocking and screaming, the corner cowering, self-plucking, and broken record remembrances of their past owners. Hey, sweetheart, oh well, come on, man. And yet, at Serenity Park, the very behaviors that once would have further codified our parrot caricatures, bird brain, mindless mimicry, mere parroting, and so on, are not only recognized as classic symptoms of the same form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder afflicting the patients in the Veterans Administration Medical Center just up the hill from the sanctuary, they are also being seized upon as a source of mutual healing for some of the most psychologically scarred members of both species. The problem with parrots is that they're so intensely attuned. Lauren Lindner, the psychologist who founded Serenity Park, told me one afternoon as we stood watching Julius pace back and forth, speaking in Korean. Parrots have, Julius was also kept by a Korean owner. Parrots have so many social neurons, their brain is filled with the capacity to mirror their flock. It's so crucial for survival in the wild to be able to know what the flock is doing, to know what the danger signs are, when they have to get together, when night is falling and they're called to roost. They're so attuned to being socially responsive that they can easily transfer that to us. They have the ability to connect, to feel this closeness with another being, another species. Listening to Julius that day reminded me of a story I'd read not long ago in the journal Current Biology about a 22-year-old male Asian elephant named Koshik, who you just heard, that resides at the Everland Zoo in Yongin, South Korea. Separated from the two female Asian elephants he was raised with in captivity, Koshik lived alone at Everland for 7 years, a period during which he construed a way of speaking perfectly intelligible Korean words by sticking his trunk in his mouth and then using his tongue to shape his own plosive trumpetings into the language of the zookeepers and local visitors. Such vocal learning, the researchers who wrote the paper concluded, isn't an attempt to directly communicate with us so much as it is a way for a highly social species like the elephant to cement social bonds via the only other species available to them. It's one of those unlikely natural outcomes of the so-called Anthropocene, the first epoch to be named after us, the prolonged confinement of intelligent and social creatures, compelling them to speak the language of their imprisoners. And now, in yet another unexpected turn, parrots, among the oldest victims of human acquisitiveness and vainglory, have become some of the most empathic readers of our troubled minds. Their deep need to connect is drawing the most severely wounded and isolated PTSD sufferers out of themselves. In an extraordinary example of symbiosis, two entirely different outcasts of human aggression, war and entrapment, are somehow helping each other to find their way again. That will conclude my talk for tonight. And with that, I'd like to pass you all on to Dr. Liz Tyson. I'm going to read a brief intro of Liz. Dr. Tyson is Born Free's USA's program director. She has a doctorate in animal welfare law. During her career, she has protected animals across the globe. She helped to establish the very first locally run sterilization program for street dogs in the Middle East. She worked with indigenous communities in the Colombian Amazon to end the hunting of wild primates. She ran a UK charity campaigning to end the exploitation of animals in circuses and zoos. And she helped design a new rehabilitation complex for rescued monkeys at Sesa Kote Born Free Sanctuary in Ethiopia. In addition to being Born Free's USA's program director, she manages the primate sanctuary outside of San Antonio, Texas, where I believe Liz is coming to us tonight. Hi, Liz.
Hi, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Charles, for sharing your stories with us. What I'd like to do now, just for a very few minutes, we're quite short on time, before we hand back to Ginny, is talk briefly about wild animal captivity more generally. So the stories Charles has shared with us has shown us wild animals suffering in captivity through powerful stories of a handful of individuals. If, like me, you found those stories upsetting, Lucy's story had me running for the tissues, then I would like you to now think about the other animals whose stories have not and will not be told, who are right now held captive around the world. And we're not talking tens, nor hundreds, nor even thousands, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of individual wild animals held captive for our benefit. And those animals are right now suffering. And we know they're suffering because, as Charles has so eloquently demonstrated, they tell us. Unlike, for example, domestic dogs, who have been rightly or wrongly selectively bred over millennia and who've become genetically different animals from their wolf ancestors, an elephant in a zoo is the same animal as an elephant roaming with her herd in Africa. The capuchin monkey in a concrete monkey house in a city zoo is the same animal and has the same needs as the capuchin living in a troop of 30 in the rainforest canopies of South and Central America. And when wild animals are denied the ability to meet their hardwired physical, social, environmental, and emotional needs, their stress, frustration, and trauma comes out in what are known as stereotypical behaviors. And those are baseless, repetitive behaviors which have no apparent benefit to the animal themselves. They are the elephant weaving her head backwards and forwards in her concrete enclosure. They are the big cat pacing the same path around their cage obsessively day in and day out. They are the parrot who's plucked all of their feathers from their chest, and they are the monkey chewing on his own tail until it's bloody and raw. Importantly, stereotypies are not seen in free-living animals. these behaviors are caused by captivity. So going to our question of the evening, what are they saying? They're telling us loud and clear that they do not want to be there. Despite their insistence to the contrary, zoos do not serve meaningful conservation purposes. The animals bred in zoos will remain captive for their entire lives. They will not be released. And the zoo industry doesn't even pretend that they will be anymore, arguing that it's too dangerous to release them into diminishing habitat. The vast number of species and the vast majority of individual animals in zoos are not threatened in the wild at all, which begs the question, why are these animals being bred in perpetuity for a life of captivity? Zoos fail to effectively educate. A child visiting a zoo will learn the size and shape of an elephant or a tiger, but they'll learn nothing from that captive animal of how an elephant should live in the wild or how a tiger should interact with their native ecosystem. Research has shown that children visiting one of the world's leading zoos came away having learned nothing, or worse, having experienced what the research refers to as negative learning. For this and for many other reasons, we believe it is harmful to educational efforts for both animals and the environment. And the final thought I'd like to leave you with is that over the last few months, obviously, we've all had a taste of what it feels like to have our movement restricted, and it hasn't been fun. And I sincerely hope that our short-lived experience of something similar to captivity might help our society think differently about whether or not seeing a caged animal really is entertaining. But I also think that this period of restriction has led to an incredible outpouring of resourcefulness. We found ways to connect with one another even though we can't be in the same place, and this event tonight is a great example of that. Businesses worked out how to continue operating, NGOs like ours continue to deliver our programs at work despite the restrictions. And importantly, an entire global community of teachers and other educators have managed to continue to instill knowledge and inspire young people without a single young person leaving their home. So if we can do that, then I absolutely believe we can find a way to inspire love, concern, and understanding of the natural world without having to stand in front of a miserable caged animal in order to do so. And on that thought, I will hand you back now to Ginny. And thanks again, Charles, for those amazing stories. They're really inspiring.
This is absolutely terrific. Thank you to all of you who've participated in this. We have a few questions from the audience, but before I get to them, I'd just like to remind you of one of the reasons we're here tonight, including education, but we want to support Born Free's work to end this cruel captivity to wild animals. So we appreciate donations of any size, and have some special donations for gifts at certain levels. And just to reiterate what I said before, the first 3 gifts of $1,000 or more will receive their choice of these photographs donated by Faisal Ismail. And they are unframed, they're fabulous. And for a gift of $250 or more, you'll receive your choice of one of these frame prints created by Liz. And they're mounted and framed, and they're about 14 by 17 inches. So Liz, do you want to give us a little bit more about these animals and where they are, where they came from?
Absolutely, yeah. So these artworks were all created specifically for this event. So this is the first opportunity to get your paws on them if you're interested. The lion you see pictured is a young lion called Girma, who was rescued by Born Free Ethiopia's team, and he now lives in the Born Free Foundation and Sessakote Sanctuary, just outside, a few hours outside of Addis Ababa. I had the pleasure of caring for him for a couple of months when I was out there, acting as interim manager a few years ago. The cheetah is one of 5 females who was also rescued by the same sanctuary, and she lives there with the rest of her friends, who's cared for by the expert team there. The other 2 photographs are both free living animals, and the artworks are based on photographs taken by one of Born Free Foundation's patrons, Dan Richardson, who very kindly allowed me to use them as the basis of these. The gorilla lives in Rwanda, and the elephant, very fittingly, is in Meru National Park in Kenya, which, for those of you who know the history of Born Free, will know that that was Elsa the lioness's home, and of course the place where this whole thing started. So those are the backstories of the prints, and please feel free to make donations if you're interested in getting your hands on one of them.
They're fabulous. Thank you, Liz. So I have there's two questions here that I think are really important for us to explore quickly, just because we've run out of time. One is, I want my child to appreciate wild animals. How can I give them that experience and not visit zoos? What are the alternatives? So I put this out to all of our panelists today.
Liz, would you?
Sure. I mean, I think I could talk for hours on this subject, but to keep it very brief, I think Charles has demonstrated a really amazing way to learn about animals. And of course, the stories he was telling were really sad, but we can learn about animals from so many different facets. And in fact, for example, watching an amazing nature documentary, which really shows how these animals interact with their environment, is a much better way to learn about them. And I think also we perhaps have to be honest with ourselves that, are we really concerned about the education of our children, or are we more interested in entertaining them for an afternoon? Because if we're serious about educating them about animals and the environment, as I say, standing in front of a very sad elephant in a zoo is not the way to do that. So I think we need to examine our motives and just think outside of the box, use our resourcefulness to find a better way that doesn't involve animal suffering.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that, absolutely. I wrote near the end of that elephant story a line that came to me one night, that, you know, even however compromised they are, a child might go, and even an adult might say they feel wonder at seeing an elephant or a tiger, however miserable they may be. But our wonder doesn't warrant another being's wounding. And there are so many other ways to excite wonder, as Liz mentioned, through documentaries. And I actually got something of an epiphany about a future of zoos when I visited Noah's Ark in northern Kentucky, which recently opened, and which I did as a kind of absurdist exercise. And walking through, I noticed the sheer wonder with which the adults and children were looking at these animatronic animals in cages. And I went, that's how you do a zoo. Just like, you know, make some computer generated images and then accompany it with a good, you know, a clip from a wildlife feature. They're just as awe-inspiring, and we don't need to torture an animal for it.
Okay, and that's great. Thank you both. And one last question, and then everyone can zoom off of Zoom, as they say. But don't zoos, someone's asking, help conservation, right? I mean, that's, I think, a pretty popular way of looking at things these days. So please educate us.
I will happily take that if people are not sick of listening to me. I think that's been something that zoos have tried to rebrand themselves as doing over the years. In fact, the original zoos dating back a couple of centuries took animals from the wild and were actually, and still do, as you know, as Charles has told us, and were responsible for the depletion of animals in the wild because they wanted to study them and have people look at them. And zoos argue that they do contribute to conservation, but as I said earlier, the vast majority of animals in zoos are not threatened in the wild. And in fact, research carried out, commissioned, interestingly, by the zoo community around 10 years ago now, but this has remained consistent, has shown that funding for conservation, which is what the zoos argue, that they need to be there so people can funnel their funding. People don't give directly to conservation. They need to give the money to the zoo. The zoos then give the money to the conservation. But actually, two independent NGOs give more independently of one another than the entire zoo community put together. And that has remained consistent for at least a decade since this research first came out. So that's simply not true. Zoos are at best, they do give some money to conservation, but they are at best incredibly inefficient means of doing so. And then of course, when you factor in the hundreds of thousands of animals who are held captive, they're also an extremely unethical way of doing so. We can do better, we know better. And to be honest, good conservation happens in range states where the issues are, and they're complex. They involve geopolitical issues, they involve working with local people. It's not as simple as we breed this lion and this lion species and this species is saved. And to pretend that it is to do a disservice to conservationists who are working in the field and really trying to make a difference on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And I know you know this, but looking up just even the budgets of the 3 zoos that stole the 18 elephants, a small, maybe 1% or 2% of their budget goes to conservation. And what they often describe as conservation turns out to be studies of wild habitats to better design their zoo habitat. So very little of their funding, with a few exceptions, goes towards conservation.
And in fact, a lot of zoos now, in light of COVID, because obviously visitor numbers have disappeared and they're in crisis mode, they've been very publicly saying the first thing to be cut will be conservation funding.
Yeah.
A lot of zoos also would register some of their funding. It's not quite fiddling the books, but it's giving this idea that breeding animals in captivity to them is a conservation activity. And therefore, when they publish their annual reports, it goes out as we've invested this in conservation, but you need to pick apart what that actually means.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid this is all the time we have. We've actually run over 7 minutes, which isn't bad considering we have a lot to say on this topic. So if we haven't answered any of your questions, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll get an email tomorrow with the link to the recording and a link to our website and to an email where you could ask for, questions. So I want to thank all of you for joining us, and especially a big thank you to Angela, Charles, and Liz for a very, very informative and wonderful evening. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Jenny.
Pleasure. Just so thrilled to be involved with the organization.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.